Hi everyone, and welcome to Linguistics 305, Introduction to Language Studies. This is our first lecture, and this one is going to focus on just some introductory information and some basics of what can be expected for the things that we're going to be looking at throughout this semester. Since this is a language studies class, we'll be focusing on language structures and linguistics, and so this lecture is going to focus on how we really think about what language is, how we define it or understand it, and then as we move into other lectures, we'll dive into pieces of linguistics and then start looking at examples from other languages and other things that really are part of the field and part of how we think about language in a linguistics setting. So the first question and the title of the lecture is, what is language? So if I asked this and we were in an in-person setting, I'd usually ask for some responses. And some of the most common responses I typically get are things like, language is a form of communication. Language is a means to convey ideas and thoughts. It's a way to organize the world around us, are some of the most common ones. And these are all true aspects of what language is and what language does. So for this class, we're not really going to use a sort of dictionary definition of language. We're going to focus on different main aspects of language and what language really entails and what makes language unique in humanity that is going to guide us as we start looking at these different patterns of language and these different aspects of language. So there'll be a list of 7 main points that we'll cover in this lecture, and then in future lectures we'll sort of dive into other aspects of language pieces themselves. So the first aspect of language that we'll focus on is that language is an essential and ubiquitous component of our lives. This is something that's around us everywhere. We use language almost every day for almost everything we do. We're constantly using language, whether it's written forms, especially as we are moving online more frequently, whether it's spoken forms. We're using language every day. Many of our thoughts are in language. We're using this as the primary means that we're using to interact with others around us. So even though we have nonverbal forms of communication, we have gestures, we have different ways of conveying certain kinds of thoughts, language is still the primary means that we're using to understand each other, to interact with each other. And it's the primary way that we're constructing the society and the culture around us as well. We're using language in order to understand each other, in order to create different sort of structures and different ways of combining together to create senses of what society means, what culture means. And this is a huge part of what language does. And this can happen in a lot of different ways. So some of the ones that are listed here, this is not an exhaustive set, are things like storytelling. When we're telling stories about our lives, about other people's lives, this is a huge thing that language is part of. Our history, we tell history through language, whether it's through oral tradition or through written forms of how we understand history or how people are telling us we're supposed to understand history. Our traditions and the sort of rituals that we have in a society or in a culture are often linked very closely to language. In many different cultures, language is a really, really important part of the kinds of religious rituals or just sort of cultural rituals that are around in everyday life. Language can be a part of things like music as well. Much of the music that we listen to have lyrics, have words, and that combination of the lyrical sound plus the actual words help create a sense of what our culture is doing, what the zeitgeist is, what is happening in the world around us. And there's a lot more. Things like law, for instance, is a huge one, especially for how we construct society. Language plays a super, super important role in how we understand law, how we interpret different laws. There are lots of linguists that end up going into law because language is such an important component of how laws are constructed, how they're interpreted. So there's a lot of different aspects of everything in the world around us that language is central to our understanding of. And because of this, it's very pervasive. It's an essential part of your own life, but then also more broadly as who we are as humankind, which takes us into the second part of what language really entails, how we can understand language. And that is that language is one of the defining traits of humankind. We think about language as being uniquely human in a lot of different ways. And this is partly because language isn't exactly the same thing as communication. We can think about communication in a lot of other ways. Communication can be seen as much broader than language. Language is the way that we're putting sounds and putting words and putting structures together for the kinds of things that we're saying and communicating. But communication can involve a lot of other things as well. So when we're trying to make that distinction, we want to focus on language and linguistics very specifically and not as much on some of those broader aspects of communication. And part of this is that language is more uniquely seen as humankind versus communication because we have lots of examples of other animals communicating through different means. So things like bees and their waggle dances, whales and their songs. Domesticated pets have ways to get your attention to communicate certain things with you. If you have pets, you can probably over time start interpreting different kinds of meows or barks as different ways of them trying to communicate with you. We see examples of gorillas communicating with each other and also even learning some small aspects of human language to communicate with humans. So when we think about the difference, we want to focus on what makes human language different and distinct from these other forms of communication. And some of them are things like our ability to use language creatively. Language is more than just a reference for humans. We don't only refer to things in the here and now. We don't only refer to things that we can point to and recognize. And this is very different than most forms of communication that are not in the human, that are not part of humans, because often in most animals, communication is more referential or entirely referential, referring to things that can be pointed out or that can be seen and that are tangible. We can also create novel utterances. We can take the different pieces of human language and we can put them together in lots of different and lots of new ways that most other forms of animal communication aren't capable of doing, at least not to the kind of complexity that humans can. And one of the ways that we do this, and one of the things that's often discussed as being most uniquely human in how language works, is this idea of recursion. And we'll spend a lot more time on this when we get to syntax later in the semester. But recursion is referring to our ability to embed things into a concept and keep adding more and more detail about a concept to where we can get theoretically infinitely long sentences and infinitely long concepts that are being conveyed. So the example here, the frog who sat on a log in the pond by the road down the street from my mother's house that has a blue roof with green paint on the sides, is just the subject of a sentence. And theoretically, I could keep adding more detail to paint the picture of what this frog is doing and where this frog is located. But it's all still just information that's adding to giving me a picture of something about the frog. And there's much more that we can add, much more that we can embed, and this is something that's often seen as very uniquely human. But even though we think of language as being uniquely human for these reasons, there are some aspects of these different features that we sometimes find in different forms of animal communication as well. So one thing that human language relies on is the use of joint attention. So by the time we're about one, we're able to look each other in the eye and follow people's eye gaze. We're able to follow the points that someone gives. So if I point at something, we're able to recognize that that point means something and look towards that direction. And there are some animals that are able to do some of this. So domesticated dogs, some captive apes, elephants and dolphins have been seen to do this, to follow the eye gaze. If you look somewhere, they'll follow where you're looking. If you point somewhere, they'll be able to recognize that you're pointing in a direction and look there. And so this is an example for domestic dogs, for instance. If you're going to throw a ball and you throw it, but you don't actually let go of it, your dog will often start running in that direction anyway because it's recognizing that directionality, that pointing that's happening. Other animals don't have this capability. So non-human primates don't seem to be able to do this, wild ones at least. Captive apes have been seen to do some of this. Wolves, so non-domesticated dogs. So the domestication and interaction with humans seems to increase the ability to do some of this, but not necessarily always. So for instance, if you have a pet cat and you've ever tried to throw something and you don't actually throw it or let go of it, your cat's probably not going to go running for it the same way as a dog will because they don't have that connection of what that pointing or what that directionality means. Human language also combines thousands of words. We have thousands of words and concepts in any given human language. English has over 1 million words that exist in the language, even though we tend to only use a very small amount of them in our everyday lives. And there are some examples of some animals that are able to combine different words. So some domesticated chimps, dogs, parrots have been taught up to a few hundred words. So even if they're learning some aspects of human language, it's usually still very limited. And even if they can sort of put things together, some domestic chimps can look at a form and put it together to create something that's kind of sentence-like. But it's usually only with tangible objects and very limited numbers of words that they're able to work with. And for Other animals that are using these kinds of forms of communication are different sort of sounds or things that refer to something specific. They can't usually combine them creatively. So vervet monkeys have unique calls that refer to leopards or snakes or different kinds of predators. So there's a call that says, hey, there's a leopard. There's a different call that says, hey, there's a snake. And these don't really vary from one group to another, and you can't really combine them in any way to create some new or novel concept. So if you call out leopard and you call out snake, this can't be combined to mean leopard snake or some other concept. It would be interpreted as, hey, there's a leopard, but then there's also a snake. So you can't combine these creatively to get different ideas or different concepts. We can also use language to refer to imaginary, past, future worlds and events, not just things in the here and now. And this is a big aspect of what makes human language unique. So even though there are some examples of animals doing some of this, so a honeybee's waggle dance can communicate direction and distance to pollen sources that are not in the here and now. So they're referring to something in the past that they saw. They're coming back and they're telling you about it so that you can use that knowledge in the future. But it's very limited. It's only specific to where they can find pollen. So the direction, the distance is all of the information that they can convey with that. Dolphins have been seen also to coordinate hunting trips through different clicks and whistles, so they can plan for things. Trained dolphins can sometimes be seen to work together to create new tricks on their own. So they're able to work together in some aspects to sort of think things through, plan things out, think about things that aren't in the here and now, but it's usually very limited in scope for what they're actually able to accomplish. The next major part of language that we're going to talk about then is that language is something that, as being uniquely human and as being embedded in what we are as humans, is that language is embedded in our physiology, in our cognition, in our thought process. And so some of this is just because of the anatomy that we have. If you look at our vocal tract, if you look at the anatomy of our mouths, there are ways that sounds are happening that are able to happen in humans because of our motor control in our mouth, because we can move our tongue in such minute ways to create a different sound, in ways that most animals don't have the capability for. So there are certain sounds that just can't naturally happen in human language because we can't move our mouths in certain ways. We can't get to certain frequencies with the kinds of speech that we're using. And then there's others that are very common in languages of the world because they're very easy to produce. So most languages have an M sound. Most languages have an ah sound because these are some of the first sounds we tend to practice as infants. And because they're so easy to produce, they tend to be part of most languages. Other sounds, much less common, so are TH sounds in English, not very common in languages of the world because they're relatively difficult to produce compared to a lot of other different sounds that exist in other languages. We also need to keep in mind that language process is happening largely in the brain. This isn't something that happens in a vacuum. This is working with other thought processes as well. So language isn't just this little spot in your brain and you do all your language there and the other parts of your life and the other parts of your brain aren't actually part of it. We're using things like our ability to process information, our memory capabilities and our memory limitations, our ability to find patterns in things in the world to also help us in how we interpret and use language. And then language is also something that's learnable and adaptable. So just because we're born learning or acquiring a certain language or possibly languages doesn't mean that that's stuck in time and that we can't change that. We can learn new languages, we can change aspects of language, and we'll talk about that more in just a moment. But that's a very common thing we do. We change the kinds of language we're using, we add things in, we take things away. And probably most importantly in how this is used in our thought process is that language is something that's functional. And we'll talk a lot about this throughout this semester. This is a functionally oriented course. It is a tool for human communication. We don't use language just for the sake of using language. It has a purpose. We need it to communicate. The kinds of language we're using conveys something. So even if we're using it creatively, even if you're doing a sort of James Joyce thing where it's more free thinking and free flowing, there's still a purpose to that. There's still an artistic goal in mind for the kinds of things that are happening with that. So we're using language functionally for a purpose. It doesn't just exist in a vacuum, and it doesn't just exist as a concept. It's something that's in our everyday lives for a reason. Now, even though this is something that's embedded in us, it's part of us as humans, language is still something that can be described as arbitrary. So for most of our words and concepts, most of the things that we do and that we use language for, there isn't really a natural or intrinsic reason why some particular thing is given a particular name in a language. And really the only exception to this is something like onomatopoeia, where the word is designed to represent a specific sound or a specific concept, and the word represents that sound. Typically what we're doing is we're abiding by conventions that we've just kind of agreed upon as speakers of a language in order to communicate. So we have a word for something, we've all agreed that that word means that particular concept, and it's just something that we've agreed upon, and if someone uses it wrong, then it doesn't make sense because it doesn't follow those conventions that we as speakers have said, this is what this is supposed to do. So for example, if I give you a picture of something like this right here, this is something that you might describe as a frog or as a tree frog. And so in English, we use the word tree frog to describe this particular photograph. But in other languages, they're going to use different sounds and put things together differently to convey the same concept. So in Dutch, this would be called a boomkikker. In Spanish, this is a rana. And even though it's referring to the same thing, they're using different sounds together to convey that. So there's nothing intrinsic, there's nothing inherent in the fact that f, and g pushed together have to mean frog, but as English speakers, we've agreed upon combining those sounds to refer to something like a frog with the word frog. And part of what allows us to do the kinds of things that we can do with language is because of the next point, that language is creative. Yes, there are lots of rules to a language, there are patterns that we work within, and we'll spend a lot of the semester learning about and understanding what these patterns and rules are, but language allows for a lot of freedom and a lot of creativity. So as we mentioned before, we can create novel utterances that have never been spoken before, for instance. This is one way that language is creative while working within the system of rules. So for example, if I tell you the sentence, there's a purple unicorn sitting on the washing machine, you've probably never heard that sentence before, but you probably immediately got an image in your head of something sort of like this that gives you a concept to work with even though you've never heard it. So our creativity of working within the guidelines, within the rules that a language has, still allows us to create new concepts and talk about new things that have never been spoken before. Other things that make language creative is that we can produce an infinite number of sentences in a language. So when we're thinking about the kinds of ways we communicate, we don't just list sentences and call that a language. We can list words and say, hey, these are the words that exist, but then we can put those words together creatively in infinite ways. So if you're learning a language in school and you come home to your roommate, you would probably not come home and say, I learned a new sentence today, because that doesn't really make sense. But you might learn a new word today and talk about that word, and then give examples creatively of how that word could be used in different contexts. Other ways that we use language creatively are things like language games. So cultures around the world, languages around the world have been seen to have different kinds of language games that show our human creativity. And this is something that shows that there are rules, because the way that these games typically work is that you're bending or breaking rules that people are already aware of. So what makes it creative, what makes it a game, is that we're aware that we're breaking those rules, that we're doing something out of the norm. So things like this could include puns, different kinds of jokes, word games, riddles, that rely on language and misinterpretation of language in order for that humor to come through. So for puns, I'm a huge fan of bad puns. If you see a picture of an otter and you think I'm cute, get otter here. You're playing on what the sentence would be structurally and replacing it with something that sounds similar in order to make that into a pun. So this is where the humor comes from, or if you're not a fan of puns, this is why you groan when you see them or hear them. And these puns are just creative ways of taking the structures you're familiar with and throwing something different in to show that you're still familiar with what the structure is, but you're able to manipulate that in creative ways. Jokes and word games are another example of how we do this frequently. So dad jokes, what we call these dad jokes now, are examples of this. Two guys walk into a bar, the third one ducks. So the first half, you have one interpretation, but then you have to change your interpretation in the second half because bar can mean multiple things. So your interpretation of the meaning of that word changes once you get to that second half. Or a three-legged dog walks into the bar and says to the bartender, "I'm looking for the man who shot my paw." Again, this can mean multiple things. So does paw refer to their actual limb, or is it referring to someone's father conceptually? So this is where that creativity and where those jokes tend to come from. And children do this also from a very young age. So a common thing in English cultures is to use knock-knock jokes. And children are aware of knock-knock jokes and what kinds of things. If you've ever been around a child that has understood knock-knock jokes, they get such a huge kick out of it because they know that they're playing around with the language. They're changing things up, and they want to see if you get it also. Things like Pig Latin are another example of children using language creatively in ways that sort of suggest that they can interpret it and maybe others can't, even though most of us have used that at some point in our lives and would be able to understand it. It's showing that creative usage even from a very young age. Also, things like riddles. So if I say what's black and white and red all over, you have different interpretations based on how you're going to interpret the word red. So is it a newspaper where you're using red as a verb? Is it a sunburned zebra where you're using red as an adjective and as a color? The way that you're interpreting that is going to give you a different answer for that, and that's where some of that humor and some of that creativity comes from. The next one we'll look at is that there are still some more examples of creativity here. So we can also creatively invent new words and new ways of speaking. And this is one of the most common things that we do. So slang is often an example of creating new things and being creative in that way. So a word like cool, we don't really think of as slang anymore because it's become so ingrained in the way that we use it. And it doesn't refer just to temperature any longer. But it started off as a slang term that has become sort of embedded into our language structures. Some more recent changes are things like using adulting and turning adult into a verb as a way to describe the act of doing more adult-like things. We didn't have this form of it, but we creatively changed the meaning and changed the word class and changed the usage of it. Same as something like mood. So rather than just saying, "I'm in a bad mood," which would be a more traditional use of it, you can use mood just as a response to something. So if you see a meme that you agree with, you might respond by just saying mood. And this conveys something different than what the word meant in its initial form. And so it's creatively changing to convey different kinds of information. We do this with technology, so as we create things, as we invent things, we need to have ways to describe it. So fax from facsimile is one example where once this technology was created, we had to have a way to refer to it, and now we even have a shortened version that is the most common. Or something as simple as the word digitize. This is something that didn't exist a couple decades ago, but needed to have some way to be described when we started making things digital and taking things from hard copies into computerized copies. We now have a term, we now have a word that we can use for this. And even things like text speak and internet speak that has been around now for a few decades is another example of creative changes to the language. So even though sometimes people will say, "Oh, the younger generation is destroying language," this is absolutely not true. They're creatively changing the language based on the kinds of things that are happening in our everyday lives. Advertising is another very common thing. There's lots of linguists that work in advertising to create different slogans, to create different things that are going to be useful and are going to fall within the parameters of a language structure. So even names like Lego comes from a Danish phrase meaning play well, and they sort of put that together. Verizon is coming from Latin and English words that are put together. Or sometimes you can just kind of create something out of scratch. So IKEA is just a abbreviation of a collection of different names and the towns of the founders of IKEA. So it's something that was completely fabricated in order to create it, but is now a concept, is now a word, is now a term that we recognize as something that exists in the world. The next one that kind of goes along with that creativity is that language is dynamic and adaptable. All languages are going to undergo change, and all aspects of language can undergo change. And we frequently do this. We can bring new things into the language, we can take things away, we can change the way that we're using things that we already have. So different sounds can come into or out of a language. So for instance, in Old English, we didn't have a V sound the way that we do in modern English, but as we borrowed lots of words from French, we ended up needing that sound because so many of those words had that sound in it. We couldn't just borrow it and change the sounds because it ended up being too similar to other words. So file versus vile. We couldn't just use the F that we already had. We ended up having to borrow that sound in. We can bring in words, which we just saw with our creativity. We can change the meanings of words, which happens creatively as well. Even things like our sentence structures can change. When we look at historical linguistics later in the semester, you'll see that Old English sentences didn't look like what modern English sentences look like at all, and have changed a lot over time. And this is because language is constantly adapting to the world around it. So as we need to talk about new things, as we need to change based on the technology that's around us, based on the concepts that are important to us, we're going to adapt our language to what's happening in our world. So for an example, many of you have probably read the Canterbury Tales at some point. And this is a revised version in modern spelling to make it a little bit easier to read. But if you read this, and if you cannot tell it me anon, then will I give you license to be gone a 12-month and a day, to search and learn sufficient answer in this grave concern. And your knight's word I'll have before forth you pace, to yield your body to me in this place. Now looking at that, you can probably get a gist and an understanding of what that means and how you can interpret that. And it's still quite different than a modern translation, and if you can't tell me soon, then I'll give you permission to be gone for a year and a day to find the right answer to this important question. I'll have you promise as a knight before you leave that you will give me your life in this place. So the same thing is being said in both of them, but the second one is using words and using structures that we're familiar with that you can still kind of get from the other version, but you can see that there's a lot of change in lexicon, in word ordering, in different ways of saying things in that 800 or so years between the writing of Canterbury Tales and how we would understand it today. And then finally, the last major component of language, and one that we'll focus a lot on in this class, is that language is structured and systematic. So even with all this creativity, even with all the changes that are happening, we still find regular and recurring patterns that form the base of our linguistic structures in any given language. And so we can see this in lots of different ways. And often these are things that are just inherent in how we understand language, even if we don't ever get taught this explicitly. So if you think about the following words that are here, there's 3 different rows. These are all past tense words. So if you can take a moment, you can pause the lecture for a moment if you want to look at it a little bit longer. Try to decide what these different groups of words have in common and how they're distinct from each other. So if we look at these, you may notice that the way that they're pronounced is what's different between them. So baked, blessed, heaped, puffed. What sounds like the ed ending is doing is it sounds more like a T sound than a D sound. But in the second row, rubbed, waved, lagged, billed, you can hear that D sound happening. And then in the third one, there's something a little different happening here. Weighted, faded, booted, coated. And it's because these are words that are ending already in either a T or a D sound, so you can't really add a T or a D, because then you end up with witted or fitted, and you can't really hear that distinction happening. So we add that vowel in so that you can make sense of it as that past tense form. But no one taught you this if you're a native English speaker. You were just taught that ed means past tense, and you're able to just apply the right pronunciation regardless. And we'll talk more in phonetics when we get to the sounds of language about why. But baked, blessed, heaped, these are all words that end in sounds that don't use our vocal folds. And T is also a sound like that. So we're using a sound that's similar so we can follow through with a similar kind of sound. With rubbed or waved, these are sounds that do use our vocal folds, so we're using a D sound that also does that to provide that consistency. So there's still lots of patterns, even if you were never explicitly taught them. And because of this, even if I give you words that don't exist in English, you should still be able to apply the correct form of the past tense. So if I give you a word like smip, you would probably say smipped would be the past tense. Croom, croomed, plute, pluted, where you're able to take the ending and know which form to use based on the fact that you know the rules for what English does. And even though we see lots of structure and lots of systems, no language is perfectly systematic. There's often exceptions to certain rules. English is by far no exception to that. And even though these aren't things that are perfectly systematic, if we think historically or we think about how the language came to be, we can usually also still explain why these are happening. So if I ask you what the past tense of dive is, many of you will probably say dived, but some of you might say dove. And this is perfectly fine. This is a word that's changing as we're going through life. So dove was the more historical form, and as time has gone on, we're moving closer and closer to using that ed ending and getting rid of the irregular form in favor of that standard past tense form. In some dialects of Spanish, when you talk about jeans, you might just say los jeans instead of pantalones, because they've borrowed that word in from English. And this is different than the system in Spanish because j isn't a sound that exists in Spanish, so they're just borrowing the sound from English when they're borrowing the word in. Or when we think about plurals of certain words, so the plural of house being houses, but the plural of mouse being mice. There's a historical explanation for this, that even though they look similar in their pronunciation and in their spelling when they're singular, the plural is different because of the historical development of those different words in different ways in English. So to sum up what we've talked about today, the 7 major features of language that we'll be thinking of and that we'll be using throughout the semester is that language is an essential and ubiquitous component of our lives. It's a defining trait of humankind that's embedded into our physiology, our cognition, our thought process. Language is arbitrary, it's creative, and because of that, it's dynamic and adaptable, it's constantly changing. But underlying all of that is the fact that it's still structured and systematic. So that gives you an idea of how we think about language in linguistics, and we'll move on into some more other aspects of linguistics and different pieces of linguistics in other lectures. So always and throughout the semester, if you do have any questions, please email me at cvanderstouw at, that is actually the wrong address, that should say at boisestate.edu. You can schedule office hours with me at the link that is provided here, and that is throughout Blackboard and also in my email response. Or you can bring questions to our synchronous classes as well. And in those synchronous classes, you can type into the chat before class starts, or you can bring something up when we have discussion times, and we can go over any questions that you might still have. So have a wonderful day, and I will see you soon.